Hello adventurers! Today we take a look at something near and dear to my heart, designing a better villain for your adventures. You see, at the end of my last campaign, which lasted about 3 years and took players from 1st to 20th level, I was playing in a very unusual game with far more players than is typical. My players were absolute units when on the battlefield and were taking on some truly horrendous villains. So right from the beginning of that campaign, I had to hand tailor nearly every enemy to fit the party. In doing so, I picked up some very useful skills and became very comfortable adapting and creating creatures. Okay, so before I get into the first step, let me tell you my design philosophy. Keep it fun. I'm running a boss, not building a house. I want to keep the boss feeling badass, doing cool stuff, whilst making that as simple as possible for me to run. Basically, if I'm not having fun making the boss, then I'm probably not going to have fun running the boss. And if that's the case, my players will be bored fighting it. So keep it fun, make it cool, and keep it as simple for yourself as possible. Case in point, in my last campaign, I used a lich. He was kind of a Vecna, Voldemort, typical evil for the sake of evil kind of guy. I wanted my players to fight a tough creature, and magic scales better in 5th edition. I will say I hate the way that most villains in raw 5th edition have these giant spell lists. Like, this takes ages to look through in a game, and it's a massive waste of time. If I were to use the lich again, I'd do something more like this. List spells like abilities. I can see everything I want to use on this character sheet. It's easier for my action economy, and yes, the stat block is bigger, but it's simpler. It's more fun. I don't need to reference D&D Beyond or the player's handbook to run this guy. So what's my first step? That's the theme. If you are going to come up with a villain, you have to come up with their theme first. What's the villain based on? In my new campaign, well, I say new, it's been running for 4 years. In my newer campaign, the villain is based on this guy. Okay, I was won over by the double-bladed sword, and yes, I know that that's stupid. My players literally met this guy and were like, hey, is he based on Thanos? But it looks cool, and remember my design philosophy. So I want to make a large, double-bladed, sword-wielding warlord. It might not be a neat and tidy theme, but it's a theme. The next step is goals. You have to come up with your villain's goals. How do they fit into your campaign? My guy is super easy. He's a warlord. He's going to war. How does this bring him into conflict with the players? Because he's got to conquer their home. Last up, that is when we start thinking about the stats of your boss. Now that we have the theme and the goals out of the way, we need to think about how tough this guy is going to be in a fight. I want him to be an end-of-the-game villain, so I want him to be tough as nails. First thing is hit points. There are loads of ways to calculate the appropriate amount of hit points for a villain, but I know this guy has to survive some high-level combat. And quite honestly, none of the ways of calculating hit points take into consideration things like your player's strategies, the magic items they have. There's no way of doing it except for just trying it out, and so I always have my villains show up a few levels before they're meant to, fight the players, and leave. By doing this, my heroes get to see what the villain is capable of. I, as the DM, get to test out how is my villain going to cope in a battle with these high-level characters, and my players get to see what's in store for them. Anything can change between now and the final boss fight, but if the villain leaves them for dead, it adds extra motivation for the players. If the players are able to defeat the villain, then the next time they meet, the villain has prepared for them. This just honestly allows you to plan your big bad guy as a DM in a way nicer way. It's not the final fight, but it's getting close. So I'm going to use a guide for those hit points, and I'm going to use an Ancient Red Dragon as a guide for how tough and how many hit points my villain should have. Hit points aren't the only thing that makes our enemies stronger. It's also things like their resistances and immunities. So I'm going to make sure that my villain has immunity to the stunned condition. Too many bad guys have been killed because I've forgotten that immunity. I'm also going to give them resistance to different types of weapon damage, possibly resistance to piercing and slashing. That'll reduce the effectiveness of some of my players' weapons. I'll also give them resistance to magical effects, so they can have advantage on their saving throws. 2 traits I'm going to give to pretty much any villain that I have is going to be an altered version of legendary resistance and malignancy. I don't like the way legendary resistance works in Dungeons and Dragons, and so I changed it to work in a way that allows them to just end a negative effect, and it's up to the DM's discretion, but it's a really nice way of complementing a player and allowing them to still deal extra damage or a negative effect. Of course, the numbers can be changed by you. I think all villains need a pretty devastating main attack, something that deals a lot of damage. And, the one that I've got for this is their greatsword, their double-bladed greatsword. That is something that is going to deal an insane amount of damage to a player. Whenever you give a villain a signature weapon, there's a chance that your players are going to disarm them. So I give my villain backup abilities to use their fists or to use their mind in order to overcome those challenges they'll face. If I'm running a high-level martial character, then I need to think about how do they deal with a range of different attacks. Like, how do they deal with groups of enemies trying to gang up on them? Or how do they deal with spellcasters trying to use magical effects against them to knock them down or to hinder them? For this, I really like recharge abilities, in the same way that you would have a dragon's breath weapon. Once they're used, they can't be used again until a 5 or a 6 is rolled at the start of the creature's turn. But these can be really great area of effect abilities or very high damage dealing attacks that you won't be able to use all the time, and so putting a timer on it makes it a little bit more fair for a villain to use. I also really like how cinematic they are, like Whirlwind Blade. Throwing the blade and having it act almost like a boomerang is a really cool ability that just does some really awesome stuff, and it does a lot of really cool damage. Like, my players expect that kind of cinematic tomfoolery at my games. Speaking of cinematic moments, I like using legendary actions, slightly different from raw 5th edition. The legendary actions I use are things that can only be used once per encounter, once per fight, and these are cinematic moments that can happen at the end of any creature's turn, and they just add a certain amount of this epicness to a fight, and I really like them, and my players have grown very fond of them over the years. If you're running any high-level epic bad guy, then you also want to make the most of action economy, giving your bad guy reactions that they can use that allow them to do something cool or to sort of set the fight up in their benefit is really important. And I also like using interrupts. This is something that I saw in 4th edition that I've stolen and ported over to 5th edition. But interrupts, basically, they don't require an action, they just happen. And I like to give them, a use of so many times a day. It just adds a little something extra to the action economy of my bad guys. And as we come towards the end of the video, the last thing I would say most people forget to do is to give their bad guys some cool equipment, just a few magic items that make them a little bit tougher. Think about what the villain is bad at. My melee titan is not very good at getting into close combat with people. When my players have worked out that he deals a ton of damage in melee combat, they always try to get away from him. So one of the things he has on him are boots of speed as a result, to try and get closer to those enemies. So I hope this video has helped you. I hope there's something in it that you really enjoyed, or you've got some ideas of things that you can put into your next big bad evil guy to make them that little bit cooler or that little bit more interesting for a cinematic fight. Thanks for watching, and can't wait to see you guys again.